And today's lecture keynote response will be recorded and will be made available on our website afterwards. If you are interested in attending any of the other events, please do. You are more than welcome. And please do encourage any of your students or colleagues or friends to come along, because we're very much hoping to have a very much public-facing conference to really engage with the public and to engage with anyone interested in different areas of accountability. Just a reminder, we have 20 or so pre-recorded papers that were presented in advance of the conference, which are available to watch on the conference's website. And for all the papers being presented, which have actually been submitted as a full written paper, which you would have received a copy of by email, these papers are eligible for our best paper prizes, which are sponsored by the publishing house Routledge. And the winners of the prizes will be announced on Friday. So do come along on Friday to actually hear who's going to win best paper. So thank you much for attending today, and I'm going to wait a few moments before beginning today's lecture. Today's lecture, keynote lecture, will be introduced and chaired by a University of Worcester colleague, Josie Welsh. The conference is supported by the Political Studies Association of the United Kingdom, the University of Worcester, and the University of Sheffield. So Josie, can I ask you to introduce our fantastic keynote speakers in 5 minutes? If we start at 3:05 UK time.
No problem, Chris, will do. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie.
My name, as Chris said, is Josie Welsh, and I'm from the School of Law at the University of Worcester. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speakers to you. We're delighted to welcome Professor Tom Ginsburg as our keynote speaker today. Professor Ginsburg is Leo Spitz Professor of International Law, Ludwig Hild Wolf and Research Scholar, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Before entering law teaching, he served as a legal advisor at the Iran-US Claims Tribunal in The Hague, and he continues to work for and with numerous international development agencies and foreign governments on legal and constitutional reform. In addition to our keynote, we're extremely pleased to have a response to Professor Ginsburg's lecture from Professor Anibal Perez-Lignan. Professor Perez-Lignan is Professor of Political Science and Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. His research studies processes of democratization, political instability, and the rule of law in new democracies. Welcome to both of you, and thank you in advance for what I know will be both thought-provoking and insightful lectures and responses. Following the keynote, we will have time to receive questions and reactions from our audience. And please do feel free to post these into the chat box, and we can, as time permits, put some of those to our speakers later on. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Tom Ginsburg for our first keynote lecture of the Questions of Accountability Conference. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Professor Welsh, and thanks to Professor Monahan also for inviting me. It's a real honor. It's such an important topic, and I just want to commend you for having such an extensive exploration of questions of accountability, obviously the central question of our time at a moment in which democracy seems to be in such trouble around the world. What I'm going to do today is to report on two related projects which are obviously central to accountability, and both are papers that I've written with two colleagues, Professor Aziz Huq here at the University of Chicago and Professor David Landau at Florida State University. One has been published, the other has in progress, and that concerns impeachment and disqualification, which are two separate, obviously related points, related steps that one takes, both obviously also focused on accountability and how to ensure democracy and its survival as an ongoing concern. So I'm grateful to them for collaborating with me, and let me just see if I can successfully share my screen here. Let's see, I'm having some trouble. Sorry for this momentary lapse. I see maybe it may be a problem with the conference advert slides still being up there. In any case, I'll just plunge in. We don't have to have slides. That's fine. All right. So looking around the world, we've had a number of prominent impeachments in recent decades. In the United States, we've had 3 in the last 25 years. Twice Donald Trump was impeached. Once Bill Clinton was impeached. None of them were removed from office. But to some degree, I think that reflects that in our country, an increase in the frequency of impeachment reflects a kind of breakdown in political negotiation among the parties, an increase in polarization. And, you know, it's something that I think we observe around the world, that countries vary quite a bit. Presidential systems vary in terms of the frequency of impeachment motions. Countries like Ukraine have had 20-something impeachment attempts since, you know, in 30 years of democracy. So in some countries it's quite frequent, in other countries it's quite rare. And the dynamics of political escalation seem to have something to do with the frequency of impeachment. In 3 recent cases, we see very different outcomes. The impeachment of President Donald Trump, the second impeachment of President Donald Trump, did not lead to successful removal from office. This, of course, would have been a situation in which the removal would have, had an effect for about 3 days, given the late date of that impeachment. But in other countries, impeachment has been successful and has led to real major consequences for the political system. In Brazil, President Dilma Rousseff, I guess you would say, was impeached, and this led to the rise of her succession by her vice president, according to the rules of the Brazilian Constitution, Michel Temer. And he, it turns out, was also, or maybe was to a greater extent, implicated in the various corruption scandals which had rocked Brazilian politics. And thus he had, had led to a real crisis in Brazilian politics and the election of populist firebrand Jair Bolsonaro, obviously afterwards. And finally, in Park Geun-hye, who was president of South Korea, was impeached over relatively minor matters, consulting with a private person who turns out to be something of a soothsayer. And she was removed from office, subsequently convicted by a court, and thus disqualified from running for office. Now, the bases of these impeachments varied, the process varied, but one of the interesting things that I think our current topic highlights is that the processes also vary in terms of the consequences for the impeached or removed president. In the United States, we require a separate vote for disqualification if there is a successful vote for removal. And in Brazil, that is also the case. And so in the case of Dilma, she was voted overwhelmingly to be removed from office, but a vote to disqualify her from politics failed. And indeed, she was able to run for a Senate seat in the very next election. In the case of South Korea, the president was not formally disqualified from running for future office, but because she is now in jail, she was unable to run, just as former President Lula da Silva in Brazil, who was jailed for corruption, was unable to run. So all those are forms of political exclusion that accompany but have a not one-to-one relationship with impeachment and removal. Looking around the world, we see impeachment attempts are very, very frequent. Indeed, in many democracies, they are part, as I mentioned before, of the ordinary dynamics of politics, in which proposals are frequent. Looking around the world since 1990, we've seen 144 different proposals by some members of an assembly or a parliament to impeach a president, 70 attempts to get them onto the parliamentary agenda. So if you think about that, that's like, more than 2 a year. 20 impeachment votes that did not pass and 22 that did pass. So that means in democracies, clearly more than, one impeachment vote a year, and frequently successful. Interestingly, of those impeachment votes, only 10 of them led to removal through impeachment. This is because, of course, sometimes there are 2 houses, sometimes there is a constitutional court which must confirm the removal, and sometimes, in some cases, the head of state simply leaves office. In the United States, we would call this the Richard Nixon strategy, where even before an impeachment vote, the disgraced former president left office, and that does serve a form of accountability. So that means, of course, that the presence of impeachment is both sort of under-inclusive and over-inclusive in terms of its effect on accountability. That is, in the case of a very corrupt president, it can lead to removal. But even if it does not formally succeed, it certainly highlights the attention on bad behavior and can, in some cases, lead to subsequent criminal convictions. When we looked in that research over time, we did not find that there was a increase in the frequency of either calls for impeachment or removals. It seems to be a kind of ordinary part of the operation of democracy. And although the targets of impeachment frequently rail against its utility as kind of an attack on the democratic will of the people, I, the democratically elected president, should be allowed to serve out the remainder of my term. When we looked at the successful impeachments, of which there have been 10, as I said before, in no case did a successful impeachment and removal lead to a major decline in the level of democracy in the country. In most cases, the sort of level of democracy is measured by political scientists using like the Polity Index or Freedom House or something like that, did not change much during the period between the initiation of an impeachment and 2 years after the president was ultimately removed. Indeed, in one case, democracy improved significantly. This was the impeachment of President Alberto Fujimori in 2000 in Peru. Fujimori, of course, had famously taken over the political system 8 years earlier, 7 years earlier. And so his impeachment was sort of a formal matter as part of the return to democracy. It corresponded with, though did not cause, the improvement in democracy. But in all other cases, it doesn't seem to have an effect. And that's interesting, I think. It suggests that impeachment, even though it is like the equivalent of nuclear war in terms of political negotiation, impeachment and removal is not anti-democratic, it's infra-democratic. Doesn't mean it should be used more frequently or anything like that, but we shouldn't see it as somehow really hindering the operation of democracy. Okay, now the way we think about this, or we are thinking about this now, is to try to tie impeachment and removal with other mechanisms of exclusion from political participation. Theorists of democracy often talk about democracy's boundary problem, which refers to the question of who, within the entire universe of people who might be affected by a polity's decision-making, who gets to vote and who doesn't, who is inside and who is outside the polis, who can participate in the democracy by voting and who cannot. And the reason it's a kind of theoretical problem is because, in some cases, the universe of people affected by a democratic decision-making might be very broad indeed. In the case of the United States, for example, you could argue that, maybe everyone on earth should be able to vote for the American president. And I might not even have a problem with that if that's how it worked. But of course, polities do have to have boundaries, and they do have to at some point say who is in and who is out. And so this is usually described as democracy's boundary problem. How do we define that? You need to do it democratically, which means you have to first answer the question of who gets to decide who's in and who's out. It's circular. Okay, that's the conventional discussion of democracy's boundary problem. What we want to do is identify another boundary problem. The other boundary problem is who can run for office. And how does one decide within democratic machinery who can run and who cannot? And this is the question of political exclusion. And what we are doing is trying to tie together the various mechanisms of political exclusion, which are quite diverse, and try to see if we can say something about them collectively in light of what they do to political competition. By excluding someone from office, in some sense, you are threatening democracy because the people should be allowed to elect who they want to. On the other hand, it has, at least since the 1930s, and maybe going back to the ancient Greeks, been accepted that there are some people whose participation in the democracy is dangerous to the democracy. The 1930s concept of militant democracy, brought by Professor Karl Lowenstein and embodied in the post-war German constitution and many others, suggests that democracy requires exclusion of certain anti-democratic forces. So that is a kind of another boundary problem which we want to explore. I mentioned the ancient Greeks, and of course the the word ostracism goes back to the ancient Greek term for ostrakon, a piece of pottery, which was used in a procedure that the Greeks would have in Athens, by which once a year the assembly could be called on to exclude someone from political life, banish them from political participation for a period of 10 years. And the way people would vote is they would scrawl the name of the person they wanted excluded onto the ostrakon, put it into a bin, and whoever got the most votes would be excluded from public participation. So it is a very ancient notion, the idea that exclusion can facilitate democracy. And yet, obviously, that also may threaten democracy if those political forces, those political actors, have a significant amount of support. So that's what we're trying to do, is trying to understand how this possibility of exclusion could affect political participation. Jumping to the United States, we in our constitutional order have sort of 4 different mechanisms of exclusion from political participation. First of all, the one I already mentioned, which is a vote to remove a president who has been successfully impeached, will lead to an additional vote of disqualification, and the term is to hold or enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. So in other words, removal from office is one sanction, exclusion is another sanction, and it is actually very rarely deployed. We've had 21 different impeachments of various officers in the history of the United States. Only 8 have been removed from office, and only 3 of those persons have been excluded from subsequent office holding. All of them were federal judges, by the way. To give an example of why that number maybe should be low, I will raise the case of Judge Alcee Hastings, who was convicted of bribery in 1988 and not excluded. He was impeached and removed from his federal judgeship, but not excluded from office. And what happened is a couple of years later, he ran for Congress, and he is still sitting in Congress today. In other words, the people, knowing of his bad behavior, knowing of his impeachment and removal for bribery, still found that he was a good representative for them and continued to return him to the House of Representatives every 2 years. So that's a kind of telling story, that the people, with all the information, may decide to keep someone who we might think that pure notions of accountability should say that we ought to exclude. In any case, that's one mechanism, one channel for exclusion. A second one is not well known, and was not well known even in the United States until the second impeachment of Donald Trump. And that was the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which was passed in the wake of our Civil War, said that, and I quote, "No person shall hold any office under the United States or under any state who shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof." What does this mean in normal English? No one who was an officer of the Confederacy could be an officer of the United States after the Civil War. The defeated were to be excluded. And it's a common thing that we see in many democracies after war, in many conflict situations, a kind of lustration, one might say, and was a mechanism that was actually came back into a renewed attention when it became clear that Donald Trump would be impeached but not removed for his role in the January 6th insurrection. Some scholars sought to revive this, to say that because Trump had engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States, he could therefore be excluded from ongoing office holding. And that argument didn't get a lot of purchase, but it certainly was a theoretical tool that would have been available under one reading of the US Constitution. So those are 2 mechanisms. There's a third mechanism of exclusion from political life, and that is one you might not think of in the same context, but that is the idea of term limits, right? That is, anyone who has successfully served for 8 years as president of the United States is excluded from the rest of their life, for the rest of their life, from holding that office. This is true even if that person is popular. And of course, this has a long history of democratic theory, a justification, which I'll get to, but basically the idea is that you're excluded not because you were too bad, not because you rebelled against the United States, not because you committed a high crime or misdemeanor, but because you were too good. And the people might, exercise their free will to continue electing you. And that's seen as a kind of threat to democracy. In other countries, we see similar mechanisms. One mechanism that goes back to the idea of militant democracy, which I mentioned before, is the idea of banning political parties, right? In South Korea, in 2014 actually, the Constitutional Court banned a political party, the United Progressive Party, which was a pro-North Korea party with 5 members in the National Assembly. And using the idea of militant democracy, that we had to, exclude those who were anti-democratic, the South Korean court decided that this party was to be banned. Many of you will be more familiar with that feature in the German constitutional system, in which the Nazi Party and the Communist Party were banned in the early 1950s, and some have proposed doing the same now for the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, right-wing party. So this is where, a court comes in and just excludes wholesale a group of people on the basis of their imputed ideas about the nature of democracy. In the South Korean case, 5 sitting MPs lost their seats as a result of that. So that's a very significant kind of tool. In other countries, we've seen mass lustration. And of course, this idea is very familiar for those of us who've been following constitutional democracy in Eastern Europe for decades. In the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, we did see lustration laws. More recently in Ukraine, President Viktor Yanukovych, who eventually fled to Russia and was deposed in the Orange Revolution, his departure was marked by the passage of a law which excluded him and a large number of his supporters, some 2,800 people, from serving in public office thereafter for a particular period of time. So that's a kind of infra-democratic mass exclusion. And there are many other examples. So all of this, how do we make sense of it? I've mentioned a lot of different things which all have in common, democracies need to sort of regulate who can participate and who cannot in terms of running for office. We come up with a typology which has 2 dimensions, and one is the mechanism sort of wholesale or retail? That is it focused on groups or is it focused on individuals? And another dimension is whether it is backward looking or forward looking. Is it the mechanism focused on bad behavior in the past, or is it focused on protecting democracy in the future? And putting these 2 by 2 together, you can put these various mechanisms into boxes. So let me start with a group mechanism that is backward looking. This clearly is, describes lustration. When you are going to ban anyone who is a member of the former regime from serving, then that's group-focused, backward-looking kind of mechanism. When you are trying to keep a political party from participating, through the mechanism of militant democracy, that is group-oriented, forward-looking, right? The reason that the South Korean government wanted to ban the North Korean political party, pro-North Korea political party, the reason the German Constitutional Court banned the Nazi Party was because it thought that the democracy would itself be threatened would that party to have gained significant power. In other words, it was the threat of winning that was the risk, not anything that any of the individuals had done, but what those ideas stood for a potential future. So that's a forward-looking group mechanism. In terms of individually focused mechanisms, well, you can have impeachment and disqualification, which I've mentioned already, which is an individual level backward-looking mechanism. Exclusion of felons from running, as in the case of President Lula in Brazil or Mrs. Pak in South Korea. Or you could have a forward-looking individual mechanism. And that's how I think of term limits, maybe mandatory retirement ages, other qualifications that tend to exclude folks from running for office. So it's kind of a 2x2 box, which puts together all of these very diverse mechanisms, but I hope in a kind of, somewhat theoretically coherent way, in that we can try to say something general about how these mechanisms interact and operate, and which ones are, how to design them to maximize, the possibility of democracy as an ongoing concern without creating risk. All of these mechanisms have risks in both directions. They're both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. The term limit, for example, obviously is excluding someone from political power who might be very popular, might be the people's choice. Barack Obama might still be president today if he had been allowed to run for a third and fourth term for office. He left office with a higher approval rating than Donald Trump ever had. So, that's a kind of constraint on democracy in a sense. But the idea, of course, is that, as one is an incumbent for more and more time, one gets better at manipulating the machinery of power. One will exclude new politicians, new blood from entering. And I think the idea behind term limits is to focus on parties, not people, to some degree, right? To encourage parties to come up with a, number two, number three. So not focusing on the charismatic individual, but to kind of reinforce the machinery of democracy by ensuring that parties have a mechanism or a kind of incentive to come up with new candidates. And so there's nothing to prevent a sitting president's vice president from succeeding him, as President George H.W. Bush did for President Ronald Reagan. But the point is that Reagan couldn't continue to serve in power, though he also left office at a very high level of popularity. So that's the kind of, the problem. We're excluding someone, but it sort of makes sense. The risk for all of these mechanisms is that the machinery for protecting democracy can undermine it as well. And let me now go through each of those mechanisms and say something about them and how to balance or how to optimize across these two risks. We're trying to protect democracy, but all of those mechanisms are subject to abuse and can themselves undermine democracy in certain cases. Okay, let's talk about lustration. On the one hand, after a new democracy takes over, there is a natural tendency to want to exclude members of the old regime from participating in political life. And the reason, of course, is that there's a threat that the old regime might come back through democratic means. The risk, of course, is that you may be depriving the polity of needed expertise, of people who know how to run the machinery, not just of government, but of the actual machinery required for modern life, technocrats and such. And a mass and overly broad lustration could actually lead to further conflict. For an example of that dynamic, think about the banning of the Ba'ath regime of anyone who had served or had a Ba'ath membership in Iraq in the period just after the American invasion and removal of Saddam Hussein. Anyone who knows anything about Iraq knows that in order to, do anything, in order to be a university professor, in order to, run a municipality, in order to, manage the electrical grid, you had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party. So disqualifying all those folks immediately meant that the new regime was deprived of needed expertise. It also meant, of course, that you created a bunch of enemies, many of whom, of course, were in the army, the Iraqi army, which was also disbanded, and they had guns. So that's a massive mistake, which made things in Iraq much, much worse than it had to be. The lustration hindered democracy. To contrast this, in the case of the 14th Amendment in the United States, which I mentioned before, At the aftermath of the Civil War, although it would seem to exclude Confederates from running for office, in fact, there were very few attempts to do so, very few trials, and the spirit of reconciliation, if I can use the term, meant that the tool was not really used much in the United States. There were a couple of years between 1868 and 1870 when there were some trials to exclude sitting judges and things like this. But the spirit of the country in terms of moving forward meant that the tool was underutilized. Now that was risky too, in the sense that it came ultimately at the expense of Reconstruction, and we had, a lot more racial injustice than maybe might have been possible otherwise. It's hard to know, but clearly it's the other approach that, yeah, we could lustrate, we could exclude you from office, but we're not gonna. We're gonna wield the threat and not do it. So that suggests some sort of optimal use, probably a lower scope of lustration, and certainly, in my view, not making lustration permanent, but simply a temporary exclusion, so that truly popular people could come back and run for office. Second category, wholesale forward-looking mechanisms, which are party bans. As I mentioned, the canonical cases here are found in West Germany in the early 1950s. And I think most observers would say, well, that was quite understandable. You couldn't really let the Nazi party come back. That would be disastrous for the country. So, having a particular party like that excluded seemed not to be crazy. Banning the Communist Party may or may not have been crazy. I mean, we obviously had many other European countries that did have communist parties. We call them Euro-communists because they were infra-democratic communist parties. But in any case, in the very early years of democracy, my suggestion is that wholesale bans of parties, even anti-democratic platform parties, is appropriate in the early years of democracy building, but not very useful and not likely to be effective in the later years. To take the example of South Korea, which is a fairly established democracy at this point, there was, in my view, literally no chance that a pro-North Korean party was going to win a South Korean election or even have a significant share of votes in the National Assembly. Just simply not going to happen. So the wielding of this collective power sort of was beside the point. It wasn't a true threat to democracy at that point. Furthermore, we often see these party bans used in countries which are hybrid democracies or maybe backsliding democracies to restrict precisely those parties which are in danger of throwing out the incumbent. So we've seen opposition parties banned in places like Cambodia and Thailand using these tools of militant democracy. I note that even in West Germany, in Germany, I should say, the presence of militant democracy provisions and the possibility of banning an undemocratic political party has not prevented the AfD from rising. And the deployment of multiple instances of banning parties in Turkey did not keep the AKP from rising, did not keep Erdogan's party from reforming several times and eventually taking power. The point being that if there is a movement that is genuinely popular, it is very hard to constrain using these tools. And party bans tend not to be effective. To me, their danger is greater than their benefit. Third category, individual level disqualification. Here there is a lot to say, and there's a lot of very, very interesting mechanisms at play. My own view is that, that removing someone from political competition is a rather extreme step. If the person retains genuine popularity, it might even enhance dissatisfaction with the political system. And let's just take the case of Donald Trump, right? You could imagine that had the vote to remove him from office been successful and a subsequent vote excluded him from running, would that have reduced his political power? In my view, it might have strengthened it among his supporters in light of his portrayal of himself as a victim, and it wouldn't even keep him out of the White House. He could obviously run his daughter or his one of his sons or something like that, and have that person serve as nominal president while he sat in the background making all the decisions as first father or something like that. So genuinely popular people might even be strengthened by reckless use of exclusion. I think I saw Yoav Dotan on this call, and Professor Dotan has done a wonderful job, great paper documenting the use of individual level exclusion in Israel by the courts. Some of you may recall in recent years that there was some discussion of Prime Minister Netanyahu not being able to run for office because of because of the potential that he was going to be indicted by the courts for corruption. Israel has a judge-made doctrine whereby those with, to run for office, you must have a good character. And the judges decide who has a good character. And they have used that, they have wielded that to say that not only, people who've been convicted of a crime must lose office, but even if you have been indicted for a crime, you cannot run for office. Think about that. That is putting in the hands of non-democratic actors a tremendous ability to shape who can participate in the political process. And in the case of Netanyahu, the public, I think, was quite aware of the nature of these corruption scandals, and they voted for him. Eventually they didn't, but it was he maintained office for quite a long time with the specter of indictment over his head. So the point is that it wouldn't matter very much, right, if you had that someone who's genuinely popular maybe shouldn't be excluded on such minor and spurious grounds. Finally, the fourth mechanism, and that is individual level forward-looking exclusion, which is term limits and other such mechanisms. Again, courts can sometimes disrupt the political system in this regard. One of the cases we point out was a recent decision by the Australian courts to begin enforcing, for the very first time, a provision against dual nationals sitting in the Australian Parliament. Now, those of you know something about Australian citizenship law, many Australians are descended from people who emigrated from Britain, and they would retain British citizenship whether they knew it or not. The Australian court, out of the blue, began enforcing this forward-looking kind of prescription. It's not that someone had done something wrong, but the idea that we don't want a dual national in the parliament because they might be reflecting some foreign interest. And without any knowledge in some cases, the Australian courts excluded those people from their seats in parliament. Quite a dramatic step. And, something that, again, probably could have been handled in the political process. Term limits, in the end, I am more in favor of. But in my own empirical research, I've noted that term limits are relatively easy to evade. And something like 25% of all sitting presidents since 1945 have tried to evade the term limit one way or the other, either by passing a constitutional amendment, maybe making a new constitution, something like that. They tend to be very effective, though, in democracies, which, of course, is our topic today. And to me, they are democracy reinforcing because they do channel that political energy into the party, away from the personality. But I just note that they aren't necessarily as airtight as one might think. Okay. Well, what can we say about all of these things when we put them together? In my view, political exclusion, obviously has to kind of walk this thin line between enhancing, accountability, certainly for past actions, but also, the risk of excluding genuinely popular actors. In democracies, ultimately, the people do have to decide. And if the people decide to go to hell, as they say, they should be allowed to do so. It is interesting that when you think about these mechanisms, I think there should be some role for non-democratic actors, it shouldn't be left completely to politicians, but exactly what that role should be, I think, is open to contestation. I've described in the Israeli case, and I could add Pakistan and some other countries where the courts have played a very active role in disqualifying people. And, that I think begs the question of why the courts should be allowed to do that. At the same time, if we leave it purely to the political process, then precisely the most dangerous anti-democratic figures will be the ones who are hardest to exclude. So at the end of the day, I do think that there's, it need not be a purely democratic process. Democratic process should not be equated with a democratic outcome. And indeed, more broadly, in my research on democratic backsliding, we find, Professor Huck and I find, that democracy is often sustained by the involvement of actors who do not themselves have democratic legitimacy, procurators and courts and such. So I do think there is a role. But those actors, when they are engaged in this act of disqualification, should be guided by very firm and strict rules, rather than vague standards like good character or something like that. There should be precision, because if there's not precision, the popular, unaccountable leader who is removed will may even gain more support by virtue of the seemingly arbitrary application of a rule. So this sort of leads me to call for greater specification of exactly what the rules for disqualification ought to be. In the United States, I think that means, maybe a new statute implementing something like the 14th Amendment disqualification, in which a leader who, loosely speaking, incited violence against the governmental machinery of the United States would be excluded. And to make rather clear, evidentiary rules to, in other words, legalize it a bit more and a bit more precisely than the vague judicial standards, which seem to be working in other countries. Party bans tend to be effective only against parties that are no real threat. So I think that they're, on balance, a bigger risk to democracy than they are a benefit. And finally, I'd say that I think that when there is exclusion, I would very much like to see, and I think the best mechanisms in our survey are those that ban the person temporarily rather than permanently. The reason is that you can come in from the cold. Brazil is about to have an election in which President Lula, who has been serving time in jail for corruption, is likely to, at least if the election was held tomorrow, would likely defeat the sitting president. And this is, the public is deciding this. They're fully aware of the charges against Lula. They're fully aware of everything that's happened in the political system. Why should they not be allowed to bring someone in from the cold? Exclusion, when it is used, when it is deployed, should be temporary and not permanent, to allow the individual to reform, to allow the public to make up its own mind on the basis of all the facts. All right, summing all of this up, democracy does have this other boundary problem. Who can run and who cannot? Obviously, democracy has its own internal answer for that, but rules are important when there are genuine threats. My own sense is that we should, we should think about this as somewhat akin to the criminal mechanisms of accountability, criminal law mechanisms of accountability, meaning fairly precise standards, proper procedures, and not overbroad, inculpation of mass numbers of people on the basis of one individual's bad action or even a collective bad action. That ultimately we have to trust the mechanisms of democracy, even though I will admit at times that seems rather fantastic given the times in which we live. I still think it's the best theoretical and best empirically informed argument for getting accountability through impeachment and disqualification. And with that, I will finish and look forward to the comments by Professor Perez-Lignan.
Thank you very much, Professor Ginsburg. Fascinating, and reminds us of the many challenges and dynamics of any particular mechanism of accountability, and those that you've spoken to in particular. We will, of course, open for questions more generally in due course, but as you say, if we could now pass over to Professor Perez-Liñán and hear his response, that would be great.
Thank you so much for inviting me and to participate in this session. I have followed the work, Tom's work, and his work with Professors Hack and Landau for a long time, and I think the presentation today is fantastic because it really takes us into a new set of themes that are very relevant for the subject of this conference. I think the question of disqualification that was just discussed has gained a new relevance today in the current context, because we are seeing a wave of anti-democratic leaders that are winning with popular support. And this brings the question, gives the question of disqualification a new life. I think the traditional assumption was that authoritarian leaders are authoritarian, support authoritarian regimes because they cannot win free elections, but that's not the case, right? Ding and Slater have this idea of, in a recent paper, of the decoupling of electoral democracy and liberal democracy, the electoral and liberal dimensions of democracy. And this means that nowadays it's elected leaders that erode democracy. So there's sort of a common wisdom in political science that we are not seeing military coups anymore, and what we are seeing is some form of democratic backsliding led by elected leaders. I will go back to this issue of coups later, but I think they are not completely out. But clearly, this makes the whole question of disqualification as a mechanism to protect democracies increasingly relevant, and therefore I think that this presentation has been particularly relevant for the topic of the conference. I want to emphasize how interesting and useful the framework to think about disqualification that Tom presented is, right? There are these four categories that I would like to remind our audience about. First, there is the issue of the mechanism of individual mechanisms of disqualification that are retrospective in nature. And here, the impeachment, the disqualification following impeachment, which was the initial topic of Tom's presentation, is particularly illustrative of this kind of mechanism, right? It's not the only one, but disqualification following impeachment is the classic mechanism of individual mechanism that is retrospective in nature. On this point, I would like to mention in reference to the presentation that I think there is still an ongoing debate in political science on whether impeachment has a positive effect on democracy and a net effect, a null effect on democracy, or a negative effect on democracy. Tom's reading was relatively neutral in this regard. He said, well, there's not much empirical evidence that impeachment undermines democracy, and I tend to agree with this. It seems to me that this optimistic view was very common early on among political scientists, and then I would say in the last 10 years, the mood has become more pessimistic in a way. Particularly, I think we see in the case of Videm scores of democracy, for example, a decline of democracy after the impeachment in Brazil, and I think that and other cases create a more negative view. So I think the empirical question is open on this regard. Then we have mechanisms, in addition to these individual mechanisms that are retrospective, like disqualification following impeachment, we have individual mechanisms that are prospective. And here comes the issue of term limits, which I think it's really interesting how this approach puts together the idea of term limits with other forms of disqualification, right? And even though term limits do not seem to relate to the issue of accountability that much, I think they do. So I will go back to this issue later. Then we have mechanisms that are collective in nature and are retrospective. And here, the mechanism of lustration that was particularly relevant in Eastern Europe is the distinctive example, right? And as I heard Tom's presentation, I thought it just hit me that maybe the way that we use lustration nowadays is kind of sort of a misnomer in this regard, because Tom mentions, of course, the classic example of ostracism in Greece, which was a mechanism of disqualification, right? But lustration, of course, was the mechanism used by the Roman Senate, right? Every 5 years, censors would lustrate the records of the Senate. But in this case, in the Roman Republic, lustration was an individual mechanism, not a collective mechanism if we think about it today. So in that sense, the way we understand lustration as a collective mechanism is slightly different. And then finally, we have collective mechanisms that are collective mechanisms of disqualification that are prospective in nature. And here the idea of militant democracy becomes crucial in the sense that undemocratic parties under certain laws can be banned from taking office, right? So I think this framework is distinctively interesting and is going to make a great contribution in the context of our current debates on how to protect democracies. And with respect to the issue of the conference, the central theme of accountability, I think there are 3 questions that they are worth discussing. The first one is, what is the connection of these mechanisms of exclusion and with the idea of accountability, right? To what extent are they all connected with the idea of accountability? The second question is, and I think which came through very clearly in Tom's presentation, is how do we make the people who implement those mechanisms actually accountable, right? That is, what is the accountability of the administrative or political actors enforcing those exclusions in democratic terms? And then finally, I think there is a key issue that Tom emphasized at the end of his presentation, which is vertical. These are always mechanisms of horizontal accountability, but these mechanisms seem to be ineffective over the long run without the absence of vertical accountability for undemocratic actors. So I will deal with these 3 topics very quickly. First, one is the connection of disqualification with accountability. I think that in the case of retrospective mechanisms of disqualification, the connection is very clear, right? Retrospective disqualification is a form of accountability for past misdeeds that undermine democracy, where this disqualification is individual, as in the case of disqualification following impeachment, or collective, as in the case of parties that supported an authoritarian regime, in the case of lustration. But the case is less clear with respect to prospective disqualification, right? Is that a mechanism of accountability? But I would argue that it is. In the case of militant democracy, for example, right, Tom made clear that militant democracy is really meaningful in the case of non-authoritarian parties, that is, parties that clearly supported an authoritarian regime in the past, and we know that therefore they will support an authoritarian regime in the future, or they will try to reimpose the authoritarian regime. It's in that case that militant democracy seems to make sense, right? So effectively, militant democracy operates, when it works well, operates as a form of accountability for organizations that supported authoritarian regimes in the past. And the case of term limits seems to be the case that is less connected with accountability in any form, right? Because as Tom very interestingly pointed out, it's in a way the punishment for being so good that people would keep re-electing the leaders into the future. But I think that even in this case, there is an argument for why term limits refer to accountability. And I think the implicit idea behind term limits is always that if leaders, particularly executive leaders, were allowed to be re-elected forever, they would accumulate so much power, for example, by appointing members of courts into the future, that it would be very hard to hold future presidents accountable over the long run if they kept being re-elected, right? So there is always the fear that mechanisms of horizontal accountability will stop working properly if leaders remain too much time in power, and eventually mechanisms of vertical accountability would stop being effective because those leaders would control so many mechanisms secure re-election, that it would be impossible for voters to vote against them if once they oppose their support. So it seems that disqualification is very closely related to accountability, even in cases in which the connection is not so intuitive. Now, the key issue is, how do we ensure that actors who impose disqualifications are themselves accountable? I think this was a crucial issue in Tom's presentation, right? Because clearly instruments to protect democracy can be and are in practice weaponized against democracy. Legislatures who disqualify leaders after impeachment are always partisan, and they are notably inconsistent with their own precedent, right? I think this is very clear in the case of color. Tom mentioned the example of Dilma Rousseff, in which the legislature disconnected the vote on impeachment from the vote on disqualification, and so they impeached Dilma Rousseff and removed her from office, but did not disqualify her. I think even more interesting is the case of Fernando Collor in Brazil in 1992, in which Collor, like Nixon, resigned right before the impeachment vote in the Senate to avoid disqualification. But the Senate said, you know what, anyways, we are going to disqualify you. So they voted, they forced a vote on impeachment, but essentially to disqualify Collor, even though he had resigned before. So there are these problems clearly problems of precedent with legislative bodies. And judiciaries and administrative bodies who presumably are more consistent clearly have their own biases, right? The experience of Brazil with the fiscal limpa rules and Colombia have shown that people not necessarily trust administrative or judicial bodies as much. So I would like to surmise that there are three mechanisms that are crucial for ensure the accountability of the actors who impose these qualifications. The first one is the idea of proportionality. It's clear that the law has to establish some principle of proportionality whenever mechanisms of disqualification are applied. And this involves not only a clear risk assessment, which is complex nowadays because modern populist and anti-democratic leaders are not necessarily overly authoritarian. So there is this whole question of what is the risk that these authoritarian parties actually can win, right? That Tom mentioned before, that has been relevant in the case of Germany, but also in the case of South Korea. But also, I would say the principle of proportionality should assess what kind of threat are we talking about, right? So, for example, it's common that leaders would be disqualified for corruption, as in the case of Brazil. But is corruption a sufficient reason to disqualify a person from running from office, right? It seems that the ratio, there is a question of proportionality here that is open to debate on whether disqualification is not too much of a punishment for corruption. The second mechanism that I would like to emphasize is that it seems to me that any form of disqualification has to allow for some mechanism of appeal, right? Clearly, in most cases, for example, disqualification based on impeachment does not allow for any form of appeal, and it seems that some form of mechanism of appeal should be crucial to make sure that the actors who impose disqualifications are accountable, and unjust disqualification can be reversed. But equally important, I would surmise, and in the third place, I think that it's very important that international law sets common standards for disqualification, for mechanisms of disqualification. And I think this is taking place to some extent, right? The European Court of Human Rights ruled that the banning of the Kurdish People's Democracy Party was inconsistent with the European Convention. And more recently, the Inter-American Court, in an advisory opinion, made clear that actually term limits in Latin America do not violate human rights. So it is acceptable and perhaps even desirable for constitutions to set term limits for the executive branch. So I think that international law has a crucial role to to play in terms of setting common standards for when disqualifications are appropriate. My last point, and just to conclude, is that I would like to emphasize reinforcing the point that Tom made in his presentation, that vertical accountability is truly necessary for any form of horizontal disqualifications to be sustainable as a mechanism of horizontal accountability over the long run. So imagine that we have, to think about this problem, imagine that we have a proper disqualification, right, for a leader or party that represents a real threat to democracy. But then what happens if a majority supports this disqualified leader or party consistently? This is the problem that Tom emphasized and that Guillermo O'Donnell, long time ago, identified as what he called an impossible game, right? This is a situation in which democracy becomes impossible, because what this situation means is that allowing a democratic outcome in electoral terms means that the undemocratic leader or party returns to power and then dismantles democracy from the inside, right? Preventing that undemocratic outcome requires a sustained exclusion that delegitimizes this regime, this democratic regime that now becomes semi-democratic, because then the most popular party or leader cannot run for office, right? So democracy gets into a trap. Popular resistance to disqualification leads the semi-democratic regime to adopt increasingly repressive measures to repress that resistance. And on the other hand, right, if any political actors attempt to lessen those disqualifications, that usually prompts a reaction from groups that fear that the return of the authoritarian forces to power will end up any form of democracy. So this trap usually creates an escalation of conflict that usually solved through a military coup, because there is no democratic solution for this trap. So even though nowadays we think that we are only seeing democratic, but only in quotation marks, only seeing democratic backsliding, this process of democratic backsliding, when they are supported by popular forces, often end up with military coups and a full takeover. So Latin America has many historical examples of this in the past, right? So leaders like José María Velasco Ibarra in Ecuador, or Arnulfo Arias in Panama, or more visibly Juan Perón in Argentina, were leaders who had an anti-democratic bent. They were incredibly popular, and if they were allowed to run, they would consistently win. So this created scenarios in which democratic competition in a way became impossible, and the military ended up taking over to try to break this deadlock, which of course did not happen. So this promotes just two conclusions. First of all, democratic erosion engenders coups in the long run, and this has to do with disputes around disqualification, essentially. And most importantly, disqualification as a mechanism of horizontal accountability is a short-term fix, right? Only electoral accountability for anti-democratic leaders guarantees the survival of democracy over the long run. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Perez-Liñán. It would be wonderful if we could take some questions, if both of you don't mind, from our audience. I've suggested that if anybody would like to post a question into the chat box, I can relay that to our speakers, or if you would like to verbalise your question in a more traditional fashion, please do put your hand up and I can move you up to presenter status. It gets very grand, but can facilitate that for you. So I think we may wait a moment to see if anything might appear. I wondered if in while we wait, if I might ask probably a terribly phrased question. That I think one thing that struck me listening to both of you speak was that there remains an inherent value in the notion of political exclusion, and whether that, I think sometimes we focus on that in terms of excluding or disenfranchising in some way anybody within a democracy, whether that be sort of voters, for example, people that perhaps don't participate in some way, and then maybe this notion of excluding participation for those that have power in a different sense or in terms of leadership. Is this question of mechanisms and thinking about, you know, the best strategies, I suppose, for accountability in this regard? Is this a movable object? Is there likely to be a common goal, a common set of values in terms of those common standards, or is that something that has to be re-evaluated? Do you think? Sorry, that's probably a terribly phrased question with many unnecessary words.
Well, let me take a crack at it. I think, you know, the way I interpret your question is, you know, is there a kind of universal, you know, right answer here or not? And I think that the answer has to be no. You know, that's going to be very contextual in terms of what are the greatest risks to the political system, what's the kind of party structure, and in particular, what is the capacity among the sort of not democratically legitimated institutions, courts and prosecutors and such, is going to be critical in terms of how much we want to give to them, what role we want to give to them in ensuring accountability generally, but in particular, the great and grave power of political exclusion. So, you know, I think probably this is, as in so many areas of constitutional design, something where it's very difficult to say there are universal right answers. I suppose what we're trying to do is identify some of the dynamics at risk, dynamics at play that allow us to then maybe make some suggestions, some normative suggestions that, you know, if you have this particular configuration, you might want this. For example, you know, one thing I said is that I think party bans should, you know, their use and deployment should decline as democracy gets more institutionalized and more confident, as people become used to it. I really think that that's a kind of contextual factor one should take into account, which, you know, has to inform whatever actors are going to be carrying out accountability. So in any case, I don't think there's a universal, but there are some factors that one should keep in mind as one seeks an optimal scheme of exclusion for accountability.
Thank you. I'm just keeping an eye on our chat box, which, in case there are any audience questions. Okay, we have one here from Harry Jansen. Harry said, in recent years, there has arguably been a shift in focus towards media coverage of accountability and the issues or scandals with people in power and a rise in populism. Do you think that this has impacted the efficacy of political exclusions and other methods of holding actors accountable?
Well, you know, and I'm very interested in what Anibal says about this as well. Yes, obviously there's a great deal of attention. The media has always played a massive role as an accountability mechanism. We're now in an era where there may be an excess of scandal, in the sense that there's certainly an excess of claims of unaccountability, or excess of claims of bad behavior, which, you know, in many cases have no bearing on reality. So it's a very tough environment, actually, because of the heightened availability of social media, the inability to deploy libel standards or anything like this, and just the general problem of misinformation. Now, to me, that leads me to say, well, actually, we should have more of a role for courts in this regard, because one thing that courts are good at is sorting out information, sorting out what's, you know, information where it's claims for which there's evidence and claims for which they're not. So it may be that precisely because of the expanded and sort of, you know, increasingly complex and, you know, unreliable media environment, we need more reliance on expert institutions which can help to make the epistemic sorting about what's good and what's bad. That's my take on it. Anibal?
Thank you. I agree with you. I think that the transformation of media environments has been very important historically for mechanisms of accountability. So, for example, the emergence of investigative journalism was crucial for the increasing use of presidential impeachments, not only in the US, but the Watergate case represented an example for journalists everywhere else, and therefore that prompted impeachment in many other countries. I think in the current context, the problem we are seeing is that the structure of the new media, social networks in particular, tends to create these communities that live in parallel realities. And this is particularly problematic for issues of accountability, especially when they involve very controversial decisions about disqualification. So I think that in that regard, I agree with Tom that courts are going to play a crucial role, because they are the ones that are going to establish what is the reality that has legal validity, right? We saw this very clearly in the dispute about the 2020 presidential election in the US.
Thank you both. Thank you. We have a Chris Monahan has his hand up. Chris.
Thank you very much, Josie. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom, for your fantastic keynote lecture, and thank you much, Annabelle, for your response to the lecture, which was excellent, and I really enjoyed both. I just wanted to say thank you very much for on behalf of the conference organizer team for attending, on behalf of myself and Matt Flinders, and on behalf of the University of Worcester and the University of Sheffield. And as an impeachment addict, or somebody whose PhD research was in impeachment, I found it absolutely fascinating. So on a personal level, this was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Okay, I'll do one last glance at the chat box in case we have any further questions. I'll make sure that everyone has the opportunity. Oh, here we go. Harry has a further question. Do you think there is an apathy towards holding actors accountable given the frequency of scandals?
You know, it's a great question in terms of our moment. You know, if everyone's being accused of corruption all the time, you know, maybe the public will stop paying attention. And I think we're at a really interesting moment, you know, in democracies and I think it's exacerbated by the various other crises we've had. People are exhausted from the pandemic, you know, they're exhausted from political conflict. And one natural response to that is just say, you know, I'm just not going to pay attention. One danger of democracies is that their citizens, precisely because they're free to criticize, you know, can lead to an overly negative view about how important democracy is. They can lead citizens to take for granted the kind of ability to form political views, to make an assessment of policies, which, believe me, if you spend any time in a truly non-democratic country, you realize is not to be taken for granted. So that apathy is kind of a cancerous thing, isn't it? Which is maybe always been a risk of democracies. There's some literature now on particular kinds of authoritarianism that we see around the world, which combines, you know, repression of political speech and political thought with material comfort, you know, and that particular combination can be very seductive when economic performance appears to be better in a place like, I don't know, Singapore or, even China. People can be content, and yet and thus think of democracy as an inferior system. But it's precisely because we can criticize, because we can be aware of it, that it sometimes seems inferior. And I don't know what to do about it. It's a great question, Harry, but I don't know exactly what to do about it. I think you're right that it's a danger.
Okay, thank you. Do you think, asking to both of you in this moment, as you say, a topical conference and lots of challenging and important issues that are surrounding questions of accountability, do you think increased public debate about questions of accountability is one means of addressing apathy toward, that may exist?
Again, I'd like to hear what Anibal has to say about this, but to some degree, populism itself sounds in accountability, right? Populism is a political movement which makes the claim that the elites have been out of touch, that they are unaccountable, and we, the people, have to retake power. So, I think that there is a demand for accountability that's out there. Now, some populisms play an important role in this regard and lead to institutional changes that end up with more accountable systems. I'd say the late 19th century United States, which had populist movements that didn't really take power, but they changed the ideas and introduced institutions of accountability. Other populisms lead to charismatic leaders who, have no interest in accountability. So in that sense, there's some raw material out there, I think, for enhancing accountability. But here, and maybe I just am simply, reflecting my biases as a legal scholar and political scientist, if you don't institutionalize it somehow, then it's not really going to be effective. The simple claim that, the elites are corrupt, we have to throw them out, we got to, replace them wholesale, is not enough. There have to be institutionalized mechanisms of generating information, of punishing wrongdoing, and of ensuring accountability. And we're in an era where institutions seem to be in trouble, like people don't believe in them anymore. But I don't see how one does this without institutions.
If I may add something, I think Tom is pointing out to what seems to be the greatest paradox of populism, which is that people empower leaders to punish the traditional elites as a form of accountability, but they do so in a way by which these new populist elites have no horizontal accountability whatsoever, right? And therefore, that's why often the outcome ends up being worse than the initial problem. So going back to your initial question, I think that this is precisely why discussing questions of accountability in the contemporary context and reinforcing mechanisms of accountability, thinking mechanisms of accountability for the 21st century is crucial for the preservation of democracy nowadays.
Thank you both. Thank you. We have a few more questions appearing in the chat box, if that's okay to keep going. Jessica Arrowsmith has asked, should social media be responsible for the political scandals publicised on their platforms, and is it questionable how these platforms are regulated by the very actors who are potentially being publicised on those platforms? It's a roundabout question.
It's a big question, and of course the answer is, their status as platform rather than content provider obviously insulates them from responsibility. We're now at a point where the big players are, in some cases asking for regulation because it's a very hard problem. If you're Facebook and you've got, a million messages an hour appearing on your platform, being responsible for all of them is very tricky. And so, they don't necessarily have the tech to do it. They're demanding regulation. And of course, whenever you see that, this is my University of Chicago bias here, that leads me to suspect that they're demanding regulation because they're in a position to control that regulation, to maximize their bottom line, that they're now welcoming regulation, Whereas earlier they were trying to disrupt everything. Well, they disrupted everything, and now the world's pretty screwed up, and a lot of people are holding them accountable. So regulation might be seen as a defensive move. I'm not an expert in it. I don't know exactly what the solution is, but I do know that it is critical that we do have some kind of public discussion about this issue. It can't simply be the case that, Jack Dorsey, a few billionaires decide who gets to speak and who doesn't. As much as I am not a fan of President Donald Trump, do we really want a world where Jack Dorsey decides who's excluded from political competition? That can't be the right answer. So we need, maybe this, it ties nicely into the claim that, exclusion is something we should really design carefully and think hard about. But the social media, being a democratic space, is one that demands its own unique form of regulation.
Thank you. Okay. Olivia Hardiman has asked a question. She says, thank you both for your insights, really thought-provoking. Something you said, Professor Ginsburg, about citizens choosing to keep a politician in power, even when they are aware of their disagreeable actions. If they had better options for representation, do you think this would still be the case? Or is it the case that citizens are willing to gloss over these actions?
Yes, well, that's a very interesting thing that depends on the candidate. So yes, to some degree, and my answer might be different than Anibal's here. So obviously, many democratic contests come down to, who's the least ugly of the two candidates in front of me. And you often have citizens holding their nose for someone they don't really like because they just hate them less than the other one. So that's certainly true. But I will say that there's a very interesting phenomenon that populism, the charismatic populism, and I'm thinking here of President Trump, ex-President Trump, really brings to mind, which is it's precisely in the violation of norms that the person wields charismatic authority. It's precisely because President Trump breaks all the rules of normal, civilized behavior that reinforces his appearance to his supporters as kind of this magic leader who can, save them if he fights for them, because the normal rules don't apply. So that's a very interesting phenomenon within democracies. Rule breaking sometimes gets you bonus points in our particular era. That's just my view. I'm kind of, and I think of Max Weber's category of charisma as reflecting this idea. But I agree with you in most cases, it's very hard to, a lot of times voters are not genuinely excited about either candidate, simply the least ugly. And I don't know how one improves that other than try to inculcate a culture of good governance and, good performance among the public through education.
But if I may add something, I think your response, Tom, is very insightful, and also points out to the relevance of, when we think about accountability writ large, to the importance of the mechanisms of nomination and the mechanisms in each country that generates those candidates, right? So in the US, the mechanisms of primaries for presidential elections are dysfunctional in many ways, and to some extent, the voters are paying the cost of that.
Thank you both. Thank you for that. Harry's posted a question. Do you think the issue of polarization also makes it hard to hold actors accountable, given that one side may see something as a scandal, whereas the other may hold it as a success of democracy?
Anibal, why don't you answer that first?
Yes, I think this is the distinctive feature of our time. It has always existed, and it is going back to the example of impeachments, right? That we discussed initially. It is not uncommon that part of the population sees an impeachment as a great act of accountability, while another part of the population sees an impeachment as a implicit form, as a sort of coup, of an institutional coup of sorts, right? This is a classic story. It seems that in the contemporary era, this type of dual interpretation of reality is compounded by the fact that people are acquiring information from very inconsistent sources and reinforce these views in the social networks. So even though this has always been a problem, it's probably going to be worse in the future.
And I don't have much to add. I think that's right.
Thank you both. Thank you. Okay, we don't have any. We have thank yous in the chat box for your responses, but no further questions. I wonder if, by way of pulling things together and wrapping up this afternoon, whether I could ask either of you for your sort of final takeaway thought in terms of maybe what next for accountability, or what is needed for accountability, either in terms of how we conceptualize it or how we ensure it, in terms of as you said at the beginning, Professor Ginsburg, about the survival of democracy.
What the big challenge of our time to me is epistemic, and it gets back to the discussion of the social media. There's a lot of falsehood out there, a lot of undermining of truth. And so reliable institutions for truth telling, of which courts are one mechanism, are really, really important for accountability. And, there's jurisprudence of accountability in various countries. Our Supreme Court has not done a good job in this regard. They've basically allowed corruption by reading the criminal statutes down very narrowly. But there are infra-legal steps that could be taken to enhance it. And I think we have to focus on that. So I think that's really important. I'm sure you have some papers on the topic over the next few days. The other thing I would say, and this is just a thank you to Anibal for his excellent comments on the paper and the project, which is, we have to be thinking in the midterm, like the dynamics here. So one of my points, I guess, is, if you exclude too frequently, you might actually end up undermining democracy. And I think Anibal has sort of supported that by talking about, making genuinely popular forces, seek to go outside the system. So that's a major challenge. How to make, how to have a kind of routine mechanisms of accountability, which will keep actors in the system and not allow things to deviate too much. Once you've had kind of a populist breakthrough like we had in the United States, it is extremely hard to put the genie back in the bottle, as we say. So now we're in a hangover, and will be for several years, while this political force, which is not interested in accountability, subsides. And there's nothing to do about that except to be a little patient and to think about the dynamics. So I think that's kind of a research direction that Anibal has raised here.
Thank you.
I completely agree. And I would just add that it seems to me that in this debate about democratic erosion and democratic survival, mechanisms of having strong mechanisms of horizontal accountability, institutional mechanisms, becomes crucial, because it often allows democracies to win time, right? In situations in which undemocratic forces have strong popular support, strong mechanisms of horizontal accountability often delay the ability of those forces to dismantle democracy until voters change their mind, or until voters decide to support more democratic forces. Of course, over the long run, if that doesn't happen, there is not much that Democrats can do to save democracy. But when those mechanisms of horizontal accountability do not exist, or are weak, undemocratic forces that take over power can move very quickly in terms of dismantling the elements of democracy, including the elements of electoral competition.
Wonderful. Thank you both for those, and thank you on behalf of those of us here today for both of your inputs. It's hugely fascinating, and I think the fact that it is so topical. There are so many ongoing questions. It gives us food for thought, and also I think a sense of urgency around continuing those discussions as well. So thank you very much. I might at this juncture just quickly hand back to Chris Monaghan as one of the conference conveners. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you very much, Annabelle and Tom, for giving up your time, and for Tom delivering our first keynote lecture of the conference, and Annabelle for your fascinating and timely response. So I really enjoyed it, and I know from the questions we've had from the audience have enjoyed it too. So thank you very much. We are going to be making the recordings of the lecture and the response available online, and we'll be in contact with you to let you know when that's going to be made available. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day in the US. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, and thank you very much, and look forward for both of you being involved with the book, with the impeachment books. So thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you all.